Hi, I'm Danny Barella. I'm about to show you an overview of shock, and I'm going to represent specifically what the cardiovascular system does for perfusion of cells. This silver pan back here will represent collectively the cells of our body which need to be reached with nourishing blood. Our cardiovascular system is going to be represented in this model, which is a fancy new squirt gun. Like our system, it has a pump. It has pipes, and these pipes have vascular restriction, okay, resistance caused by a nozzle, and they have fluid represented in this case by plain water, the most consistent part of our human anatomy, and a shell that contains it. So let's take up the squirt gun and see if we can in fact reach the needs of our cells. So as long as the pump is working, and we can always adjust the velocity, the heart rate, we can sometimes squeeze a little harder or a little more, changes in contractility and therefore stroke volume, to get us a little stronger push. The volume is pretty well consistent unless if we have more output than we have intake. So for example, if you have a lot of nausea and vomiting, you're going to lose fluid, and this creates hypovolemia. One of the first ways that we discover hypovolemia is when a person in hypovolemic shock decides to get up suddenly after they've been laying down. In other words, they change their position. So when you've got pretty good perfusion in one position and then not very good perfusion in another position, that is called a positive tilt test. But next we're going to go over the mechanisms by which the cardiovascular system can put us into a shock state. One of the first is when the pump fails to pump properly, a condition known as cardiogenic shock. So I'm over here pumping away, doing just fine, when all of a sudden I have a lack of perfusion to my hand. My hand is all of a sudden very weak. Another option would be as if my hand had a myocardial contusion. So if in fact I damage the myocardium with a contusion, I would find that I have less contractility, less strength for contraction, and that is definitely going to show up as difficulty in reaching the needs of my cells. Of the most common reasons why we see cardiogenic shock is because we cut off circulation to the heart. And as we cut off that circulation to the heart, we have less perfusion of the heart muscle, and that's another reason why we're going to have a real hard time with having the strength to do a reasonable amount of perfusing our cells. So that's cardiogenic shock. Now, similar, we can have obstruction to the function of the heart. So if I had something that was impeding my stroke volume, but it wasn't the heart itself, it was from outside the heart, then that would be considered a obstructive shock. Examples of that are pericardial tamponade and tension pneumothorax. In both of those cases, what we see is that we have a restriction in movement of the heart, or a something that's obstructing the refill of the heart. And so I'm going to represent that by obstructing the movement of my plunger here. And we'll see how that affects us. Again, the heart has to work extra hard, sometimes tries to compensate by increasing heart rate, but the effect is still under perfusion of the tissues of the body. Next, let's take a look at distributive shock. Distributive shock includes anaphylaxis, neurogenic shock, and septic shock. All of these have something to do with the effectiveness of the pipes in delivering flow of blood to the cells. It can mean a change in volume of the container. In this case, we can see that we already have a little relative hypovolemia. We have the shell, but the fluid isn't filling it completely. And the other aspect of distributive shock is lack of resistance. And as you see here, I have two nozzles. So with one nozzle, I'm going to see what happens if we take away, let's pick the big one here. If we take away resistance, So with less resistance, are we going to have a difficult time in getting perfusion to the target cells of our body? Let's see. Well, I certainly seem to be running out of fluid quickly, but it's not reaching the end tidal or the end organs that I want to reach. So without resistance, we're going to have a really hard time in getting the fluid where we want it to go. Compare that to the healthy system, which is still able to get it pretty far out there. All right. Next, I want to talk about hypovolemic shock. Now, we illustrated earlier where you could have fluid loss from a natural opening. This is often referred to as metabolic shock. And in fact, it's a state of dehydration that can come from excessive nausea, vomiting, or sweating. In the case of heat exhaustion, it could just be a lack of keeping fluids in that you're losing while your body's trying to compensate for heat. In the case of diabetic ketoacidosis, where your kidneys are trying to balance volume and you have a high viscosity in the blood sugar going in the blood going to the kidneys, you end up urinating a lot. So frequent urination is another cause of dehydration and in turn hypovolemic shock. All of those are from a natural opening. But the biggest culprit in terms of hypovolemic shock is hemorrhagic shock. Now, we can lose blood for a number of different ways, but primarily from trauma. We call it penetrating trauma or blunt trauma. With penetrating trauma, we can see that our shell is broken into by penetration from a penetrating object. And again, this is a place where we can lose a lot of volume, and just like other states, we will be able to compensate by pumping faster, by squeezing harder, until we run out of that critical volume and just can't get the fluid out. The other way that we're going to see trauma causing hypovolemic shock is the hemorrhage caused by blunt trauma. And this will primarily hit solid organs and cause rupture of solid organs where we're going to lose blood, either from the fracture of the organ or breaking of blood vessels that feed it, or tearing and shearing forces that affect that. And again, we can lose a lot of blood in that regard, and in a short period of time, we will not be able to compensate for that fluid loss and will stop reaching our cells. But notice that for quite a while, as long as I can keep the pump primed and I can pump a little faster, I can compensate for that lack of volume until it hits a critical threshold. And of course, the other thing is we are never exclusively going to have one form of shock without another. As patients deteriorate into more and more hypoxia, the cells, as they break down, are going to release toxins that are going to affect the resistance in blood vessels by causing vasodilation. And if we have neurogenic shock from a spinal injury at the same time that we have trauma, then we have a system called multiple systems trauma.